Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here again because, like us, you're fascinated by the world of politics and how things actually work, especially when it comes to new laws and what they really mean.
Absolutely. And today we're diving into some pretty significant changes in how the federal government approaches disaster preparedness. Specifically, we're looking at the executive order Achieving Efficiency Through State and Local Preparedness, which came out on March 18th of this year, 2025.
Right, so we'll try to make sense of what this shift actually
Right,
means,
that's the plan.
and we'll do that by going straight to the source. We have the actual executive order itself, the official timelines for how all these policy changes are going to happen, and a bunch of expert analysis from different organizations that have been really digging into this.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
So to kick things off, the main idea behind this executive order is all about pushing more of the responsibility for disaster preparedness down to the state and local levels.
That's the gist of it. The idea is to flip the script a bit, moving away from a top-down approach and putting more power in the hands of the states, localities, and even individuals.
Okay, so a more bottom-up approach, empowering local communities. Why the change?
Well, the order argues that a truly resilient nation has to be built from the ground up. It's saying that local communities are actually better equipped to understand their own specific risks and needs, and therefore can prepare more effectively.
And I guess the thinking is that if every community is prepared, then the whole nation is more resilient.
Exactly. It's about distributing responsibility and making resilience more granular. The executive order also emphasizes some pretty ambitious goals. They're aiming to enhance national resilience overall, of course, but also to be more effective at saving lives, protecting livelihoods, and even easing the burden on federal taxpayers through more efficient local management.
So it's framed as a win-win, both improving preparedness and saving money.
That's the idea. And the executive order is really explicit about this shift. There's a line in there that says, preparedness is most effectively owned and managed at the state, local, and even individual levels.
So it's not just a suggestion, it's like the core belief driving this whole thing.
That's right. And it doesn't stop at just stating our belief. This executive order lays out a whole set of actions, a bunch of policy reviews that are supposed to put this philosophy into practice.
So it's not all talk, there's a real plan for action.
There is. It's a pretty structured timeline, too. It starts with the National Resilience Strategy, which the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, or APNSA, has to deliver within 90 days of the order being issued. That means the deadline is somewhere around June 16th, 2025.
June 16th, got it.
Uh-huh.
And who's actually putting this strategy together?
It's a team effort involving the APNSA, the Assistant to the President for Economic Policy, and a bunch of agency heads. They're all working together to figure out what our national resilience priorities should be.
Okay, so that's the first big step. What comes next?
Well, after that, there are two more big policy reviews that need to be done within 180 days of the order. That puts the deadline around September 14th, 2025.
September 14th, noted. And what are these reviews focusing on?
The first one is all about national critical infrastructure policy. The APNSA, along with the director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy and some other agency heads, are going to be combing through all the existing policies related to critical infrastructure and figuring out what needs to be updated, removed, or replaced.
That sounds like a huge undertaking.
It is, but the goal is to make our critical infrastructure more resilient, which is obviously a pretty big deal.
Makes sense. What's the other 180-day review about?
That one's focused on national continuity policy. Again, the APNSA is in charge, working with agency heads to look at all the policies that deal with keeping essential government functions running during and after a crisis.
So basically, making sure the government can still operate even if something really bad happens.
Exactly. Both of these reviews have similar objectives. They want to modernize these policies, make sure they're actually focused on real risks, not just hypothetical ones, and make sure they're in line with that national resilience strategy that's being developed.
So it's all about connecting the dots, making sure everything works together.
Right. And there are some specific policies that are being called out for review, too. Like for critical infrastructure, they're looking at National Security Memoranda 16 and 22, which are all about supply chain and cyber resilience, and Executive Orders 1-17 and 14-123.
Interesting. So those are the 180-day reviews. What happens after that?
Then we move into the 240-day reviews, which are due around November 14th, 2025. There are two main areas they'll be looking at.
Okay, so November 14th, what are those two areas?
The first one is preparedness and response policies. It's a huge review of all national policies related to how we get ready for and respond to disasters. The APNSA is, again, leading the charge, working with agency heads and getting input from the FEMA Council.
Sounds like a really comprehensive review. What are they hoping to achieve with this one?
The main goals are to redefine the federal government's role in preparedness and response, to move towards a more targeted, risk-informed approach, and to make sure everything aligns with that national resilience strategy we talked about earlier. They're looking at some pretty big policies here, too, like Executive Order 12656, Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5, and a whole bunch of presidential policy directives.
Wow, so they're really rethinking how the whole system works. What's the second 240-day review about?
The second one is about creating a national risk register. The APNSA is working with the director of the Office of Management and Budget and some agency heads on this one. The idea is to have a document that clearly identifies and describes all the biggest risks to our national infrastructure. And it's not just about listing them out, they're supposed to actually quantify these risks.
Quantify, so they're putting numbers to it.
Yeah, exactly. They want to know how likely each risk is and how bad the impact would be. The idea is that this register will help everyone make better decisions, from the intelligence community to private sector investors to folks working on the federal budget.
So having a clear picture of the risks should lead to better planning and resource allocation.
Exactly. And both the National Resilience Strategy and the National Risk Register will be reviewed and potentially updated at least every 4 years.
So it's not a one-time thing. They're building in a process for ongoing review and adaptation.
Makes sense. Things change, new risks emerge, so it's important to be flexible.
Definitely. Okay, so we've covered the 90-day strategy and the two sets of 180-day reviews and then the 240-day reviews. Is there anything else?
There's one more review with a longer timeline. It has a 1-year deadline, which means it's due by March 18th, 2026.
Okay, so a full year to get this one done. What's it about?
It's focused on something called the Federal National Functions Constructs. The Secretary of Homeland Security is responsible for updating the policies that define these constructs. The goal is to make sure that everyone, from state and local governments to individual citizens, clearly understands the role the federal government plays in different national functions.
So it's about communication and transparency, making sure everyone's on the same page.
Right. And to make sure this happens smoothly, there's going to be close coordination with the National Security Council.
Okay, so that's a lot of reviews and a lot of changes. What's the thinking behind this big push for localized preparedness? What's the main argument for making this shift?
The core idea is that by empowering communities at the state and local levels, we can build a stronger and more resilient nation.
Okay, so more resilient communities mean a more resilient nation.
Exactly. They argue that local communities are just closer to the action. They understand their own risks and vulnerabilities better than anyone else, so they're in the best position to prepare effectively.
Makes sense. What are some of the other arguments in favor of this localized approach?
Well, they also say it's a more efficient way to use resources. If local communities are handling more of the preparedness work, it could potentially reduce the need for large-scale federal intervention and funding.
So it's about saving taxpayer money, too.
Right. And then there's the argument that it can actually foster greater prosperity. The idea is that if communities are more self-reliant and resilient, it creates a stronger foundation for local economies.
So it's about more than just disaster preparedness. It's about building stronger communities overall.
Right. It's a multifaceted approach. And
Yeah.
then there's the simple fact that people who live in a particular community are the ones who benefit most directly from having strong local preparedness.
So it's about putting power and resources directly into the hands of the people who need them most.
Exactly. And a localized approach means you can tailor your preparedness strategies to the specific risks of each region. Like, hurricane preparedness on the Gulf Coast is going to look very different from wildfire mitigation in the West.
So a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't really work for something as complex as disaster preparedness.
It doesn't. And finally, the argument is that this shift will actually make the federal government more efficient, too. They'll be able to streamline their operations and focus on providing targeted support to state and local initiatives rather than trying to manage everything from the top down.
So it's about making the whole system more efficient and effective. Sounds good in theory, but as with any big policy change, there are bound to be some concerns. What are some of the potential downsides that people have raised?
Oh, yeah. There are definitely some criticisms and concerns. One of the biggest worries is that this shift could actually weaken our overall national disaster readiness.
Really? How so?
While some experts are concerned that by shifting so much responsibility away from the federal government, we might be undermining our ability to respond to really large-scale disasters, the kind of events that cross state lines and require a lot of coordination.
So the concern is that we might not be as prepared for a major catastrophe if we're relying more on a patchwork of local responses.
That's right. And there's also concern that this shift could actually make things less efficient in some cases. Like, if each state has its own way of doing things, it could make it harder to coordinate resources and share information during a big event.
It could create a lot of chaos and confusion.
Exactly. And then there are concerns about how this will affect FEMA.
FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Right. They've historically played a huge role in coordinating disaster response, but some people are worried that they might get sidelined in this new system.
So there's a concern that we might be losing some valuable expertise and experience at the federal level.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's the money issue. Shifting responsibility to the states and localities could end up costing them a lot more money.
I can see how that would be a problem, especially for states that are already struggling financially.
Exactly. And there's a worry that some states might just not be able to handle the added burden, like states with weaker economies or those that are frequently hit by disasters might not have the resources to really step up their preparedness efforts.
So it could create a situation where some states are really well prepared and others are left behind.
Right. And that could actually make things less safe overall because a disaster in one state can easily spill over into neighboring states.
It's all connected.
It is. And then there's the issue of unfunded mandates.
Unfunded mandates, what are those?
Basically, it's when the federal government tells states or localities to do something but doesn't give them the money to do it.
So it's like, you're in charge now, but you're on your own financially.
Exactly. And that could put a huge strain on local budgets, especially in areas that are already struggling.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good. What are some of the other concerns people have raised?
Well, some folks are worried that we might end up with a patchwork of different preparedness standards across the country. Like, if each state has its own plan and its own way of doing things, it could make it really hard to coordinate responses during a big event.
Imagine trying to get help from a neighboring state, and their equipment doesn't even work with yours.
Right. That's the kind of logistical nightmare people are worried about.
I see their point.
And then there are lessons we've learned from past disasters, like Hurricane Katrina. That event really showed how important it is to have a strong federal response capability, especially when local resources are overwhelmed.
Right, sometimes you just need that national level coordination and support.
Absolutely. And some experts are concerned that this shift towards localized preparedness might make it harder to handle those kinds of catastrophic events.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of potential downsides. Can you walk me through some of the specific concerns about reduced federal coordination in a bit more detail?
Sure. So, as we mentioned before, FEMA has always played a big role in coordinating responses to large-scale disasters.
Right, like making sure everyone's communicating and that resources are getting where they need to go.
Exactly. And if FEMA's role is diminished, some people are worried that we might see a more fragmented and less efficient response.
So instead of having one central command, it's more like a bunch of separate groups trying to figure things out on their own.
Right. And that could lead to all sorts of problems. Gaps in essential services, duplication of efforts, delays in getting aid to people who need it.
It sounds like it could be really chaotic.
It could. And then remember how we talked about the possibility of different preparedness standards in different states? Well, that could really complicate things when it comes to mutual aid agreements.
Mutual aid agreements.
Yeah, those are agreements between states where they promise to help each other out during emergencies.
Oh, right, like sending firefighters or medical personnel across state lines.
Exactly. But if those states have different training standards or use different equipment, it can be really hard to make those agreements work smoothly.
It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And then, of course, there are those lessons we learned from Hurricane Katrina. That disaster showed us that sometimes even the best prepared local communities can get overwhelmed. And when that happens, you need a strong federal response to step in and provide support.
So it's not just about being prepared for the everyday disasters, it's also about having the capacity to handle the really big ones.
Right. And some people are worried that this shift away from federal coordination might leave us less prepared for those kinds of catastrophic events.
Okay, so that's the coordination piece. What about the financial implications for states and localities? That seems like a major concern too,
It is. As we've talked about, one of the big worries is that this shift in responsibility could put a huge financial burden on state and local governments.
especially for those that are already struggling to make ends meet.
Exactly. And it could really exacerbate the existing disparities between states. Like, states with strong economies might be able to handle it, but states with weaker economies might really struggle.
So it's like a rich get richer, poor get poorer kind of situation.
It could be. And then there's the whole issue of unfunded mandates, which we talked about earlier. If the federal government is expecting states and localities to take on all these new responsibilities without giving them the money to do it, that's a big problem.
It's like setting them up to fail.
It could be.
Hmm.
And then you have states that are just more prone to disasters, like those along the coast that get hit by hurricanes regularly. They could end up bearing a huge financial burden if they're expected to shoulder the majority of the costs for preparedness, response, and recovery.
It's a lot to ask, especially for communities that are already stretched thin.
It is. And it raises the question of whether this shift in responsibility is really fair or sustainable in the long run.
Right. It's one thing to say that local communities should be empowered, but it's another thing entirely to actually give them the resources they need to succeed.
Absolutely.
But on the flip side, the executive order does mention that the federal government will be updating policies and streamlining operations to better support this localized approach. What does that actually mean in practice?
Well, the idea is that the federal government will still play a role, just a different one.
So instead of being the main actor, they're more like a supporting character.
Right. They're still going to be providing guidance and resources, but they're going to be doing it in a way that's more aligned with local needs and priorities.
Okay, so less top-down, more collaborative.
Exactly. And a big part of this is going to involve those policy reviews we talked about earlier. The goal is to simplify and clarify existing federal policies, make sure they're actually focused on the most important risks, and integrate them with the national resilience strategy.
So it's about making the federal government more efficient and effective in its supporting role.
Right. And they're also going to be working on improving communication so that state and local governments, as well as individual citizens, have a clear understanding of the federal government's role in disaster management.
So less confusion, more transparency.
Exactly. The overall objective, as stated in the executive order, is to ensure a competent, accessible, and efficient federal government that effectively supports state and local preparedness initiatives.
So they're not abandoning ship entirely, they're just trying to find a more effective way to contribute.
That's the idea. But even with these efforts to improve federal support, there's still that big question about resource disparities between states. How can we ensure that every community has a baseline level of preparedness when some states have so much more money and capacity than others?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is. And it's one of the biggest challenges this new approach is going to have to grapple with. If we don't find a way to address those disparities, we could end up with a really uneven and potentially inadequate level of national resilience.
So it's not just about empowering local communities, it's also about making sure they have the resources they need to actually be empowered.
Exactly. And if we don't figure that out, we could end up creating a system where some communities are left far more vulnerable to disasters than others simply because of where they happen to live.
So this executive order really raises a lot of questions about the balance between local control and federal oversight. It's clearly trying to find a more efficient and locally driven approach to disaster preparedness, but there are some serious concerns about whether it will actually make us more resilient as a nation.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Definitely. But it's a conversation we need to be having. And for our listeners out there, if you want to dig deeper into this issue, we encourage you to check out the executive order itself, the various policy documents we've mentioned, and the reports and analyses from organizations like the Natural Resources Defense Council and the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Yeah, do your own research.
There's a lot of information out there, and it's important to form your own informed opinion on this important issue.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening, everyone.
And we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.